This is the Classical Ideas Podcast. Welcome to episode 11 of the Classical Ideas Podcast. I'm Greg Soden. When I was a senior in high school, I had zero knowledge of Islam, and I tell my students just that. I am proud that when my students leave high school, they have had the opportunity to read and discuss portions of the Quran, visit a masjid or mosque if they choose, and meet and talk to practitioners of Islam, a religion of 1.7 billion people worldwide. Given the political reality of the world today, learning about Islam is important for non-practitioners, and I'm glad you're listening today. Today, it seems like Islam is a lightning rod that constantly appears in our news cycles because of the human rights crisis in Syria, the longest American war of all time in Afghanistan, the ongoing ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya Muslims of Myanmar, the discussions around the issue of the Jewish Israelis and the Arab Palestinians, and the constant political polarization that has become prevalent in Western societies around Europe and North America for the past several years. Because such events are talked about to varying degrees of quality on major media outlets, many folks would have you believe they know about Islam and the Muslims of the world. In my mid-20s, I started learning about Islam because I was teaching in England, and they had many Muslim students in my school, and I became really interested in Islam in order to better reach my students in class. I read Karen Armstrong's Islam, A Short History. I started following the work of Somali-British BBC reporter Raga Omar. I read No God But God by Reza Aslan, and I also followed the thoughts of his detractor Sam Harris, who also collaborated with another author I like called Majid Nawaz. I read Ziauddin Saudar's What Do Muslims Believe? I pushed myself to study the history of the context of the situation in Israel, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. I started following current events involving Islam in Muslim-majority countries. I found I loved the poetry of Rumi and studying the practices of Sufism, which will definitely be the focus for a future podcast episode. So fast forward to today. Today, I try to be as open as possible with my students about how little I knew about Islam when I was their age. I think that because I'm so open about my lack of knowledge when I was their age, they open up a little bit to being more curious. I make them write down any question that comes to mind, and then I help them revise their questions. They see me wrestle with questions all year long, and I want them to wrestle too. I especially want them to wrestle with questions when it comes to Islam. When I started teaching about Islam, I wanted my students to interact with local young Muslims and to ask them questions about what it's like to be young and Muslim in the Midwest of the United States. I also make them read huge portions of the Quran, which I'm certain a substantial majority of American folks have never done, though I think that everybody should give it a go. I also think Americans should have curious conversations with Muslims, one-on-one, face-to-face, in person. I am so excited for today's episode because I have personally learned so much from the guest on this episode. She is an inspirational thinker and activist, and I'm so grateful to her for coming on the Classical Ideas podcast. My guest today has visited my class for the past 2 years and always holds fantastic conversations with my students. Today, I'm talking with Farah El-Jayousi. Farah is a Palestinian American who grew up in Columbia, Missouri. She graduated from the University of Missouri in 2015 with degrees in psychology and women's and gender studies, and now works for LaunchGood, a global crowdfunding platform for Muslims, as a campaign coach and the social media manager. She recently spent time in refugee camps in France and Greece as a medical interpreter. In her free time, Farah also makes art and performs original poetry. So, without further ado, I bring you Farah El-Jayousi.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق اقرأ وربك الأكرم الذي علم بالقلم علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم.
What surah was that?
So that was Surah Al-Alaq, which the first 5 verses in that chapter were the first verses to be revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him.
So is that, what number is that? Is that 81?
I'm not actually sure.
I can't remember which one is actually the first one. So why did you pick that one?
I mean, part of it is just those are the first verses, and I think they kind of set the stage for what Islam is about and its purpose. And the first verse is basically recite or read in the name of your Lord who created. So the very first command given to Muslims is to read or to seek knowledge.
Lovely. Well, welcome to the Classical Ideas podcast. It's so good to have you here. Thanks for coming. So I know that you just got back from a long trip abroad, and I was following the trip on Facebook, and I was loving looking at your pictures and reading your daily reflections. Can you kind of tell where you went and kind of what you did?
Yeah, so I went towards the end of July and beginning of August, and I went on a interfaith delegation of Muslims, Christians, and Jews. It was sort of a collaboration between the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, Jewish Voice for Peace, and American Muslims for Palestine. So we were on the ground for about 2 weeks, and we primarily stayed in Jerusalem, but we went all over Palestine and Israel. And we went at a very critical time as well, which was completely unplanned, but that was kind of just how it happened. So when we were getting ready to leave for our trip was about the time when a bunch of demonstrations were happening around the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So what essentially happened, like a quick rundown of events, is 3 cousins who are Palestinian killed, I believe, 2 Israeli policemen who were near the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And following that, the state of Israel installed like metal detectors and surveillance cameras on the around the gates of the mosque after shutting it down for about a week. And the Friday prayers were canceled for the first time since like 1969. And the Islamic Trust that is responsible for the mosque was really against the idea of like these surveillance cameras and metal detectors because it impedes Palestinians' right to worship. And so they refused to enter the mosque until those were removed, and that led to very massive, peaceful, nonviolent demonstrations where every time it was time for prayer, the Muslims of the city, along with a lot of the Christian Palestinians of the city, would pray outside of the gates of the mosque in protest. And so 2 days before we traveled was when they did this during the Friday prayers, and it was kind of called a day of rage. Those were like some pretty massive protests, and we arrived 2 days after that. And the protests were still kind of continuing, and they finally took down the cameras and the metal detectors while we were there, and we were staying actually like right outside of the gates of the old city. So we were kind of witnesses to a lot of what was going on, and I got to pray and attend Friday prayer right after it was opened. although they did not allow men under the age of 50, so members of our delegation were not actually allowed to come to Friday prayer. But it was definitely a very remarkable time to be there and to witness that kind of activism.
What was it like to go to Friday prayers at Al-Aqsa?
It was like really overwhelming. I think it would be overwhelming in normal circumstances, but especially under those circumstances where, it was still tense because we had to go through, I think, 3 or 4 checkpoints just to get into the compound. And these checkpoints were set up by the state of Israel. And it felt, that part felt just very surreal that in order to go to a place of worship, I had to go through these checkpoints that were manned by essentially soldiers with machine guns who were kind of determining who got to go and pray in like the third holiest site in Islam. Or even like someone I was going there with was a convert to Islam. And before we actually entered into the site, she was kind of questioned as to whether she was really Muslim by people who were not Muslim themselves. So it was a very weird kind of situation to be in, but at the same time, like to be in that space right after these nonviolent demonstrations were essentially successful in taking down this surveillance that impeded on people's rights. It was really overwhelming, like as a Muslim and also as a Palestinian, to kind of see that happen.
So speaking of checkpoints, I know that you were able to go into Palestine a lot. Did you go into, was it just the West Bank?
So we stayed in Jerusalem, which kind of has a special status. We were in East Jerusalem. But we also went into the West Bank. So we went into like Bethlehem. We went to Ramallah. We went to Hebron, which is also kind of related to what was happening at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So Hebron, that is the site of the Ibrahimi Mosque, which has significance for Muslims, Christians, and Jews. But currently it is split into 2, where Muslims are allowed in one side but not in the other, and Jews are only allowed in the other side. And that city is very much divided along racial and religious lines, and it's a segregated city, and Palestinians are very worried that the same thing is going to happen at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the installment of the security cameras and the metal detectors was seen as like a first step towards that. But we also went to like Nazareth, for example. We went to Jaffa, and a lot of different places all over.
So how does how does it feel going from the side of the walls into the other? Like how does it shift? How does the tone of life shift? How does the quality of life shift going from one side to the other?
Yeah. It's pretty significant, and it's just very stark. Even if you just look at Jerusalem itself. So if you compare East Jerusalem to West Jerusalem, East Jerusalem is primarily Palestinian, West Jerusalem is primarily Jewish Israeli. East Jerusalem is like you see the Israeli military everywhere, and movement is very much controlled. Quality of life and access to resources is very, very profoundly different. Palestinians do not have the same resources that Jewish Israelis do. Palestinians in East Jerusalem actually have a different status than Palestinians with Israeli citizenship in other parts of Israel. So Palestinians in East Jerusalem are granted a permanent residency. These are people who have been in Jerusalem for centuries. Like these are very old families, but they are given the status of permanent residents, and they have to meet certain requirements year after year in order to hold that status of permanent residency. And it can be revoked at any time. And they can no longer live in the city that is the city of their ancestors.
So going there must be, I mean, you must have some pretty strong emotions about it, considering that is what you were descended from, right?
Yeah.
So where is your family from in that region?
My family is from a tiny village called Kur, which is in the municipality of Tulkarem, which is in the West Bank. But I also have family on both sides, because the municipality of Tulkarem originally was not just in what is now known as the West Bank. So I have family members with Israeli citizenship, and I have family members who live in the West Bank.
Were you able to see family when you were there?
I was able to see my family that was on the Israeli side in the town of Jaljulia, and spend an afternoon with them, and eat some figs from my hometown that were grown there, which was really great. Yeah.
Awesome. It's such an interesting and just a tragic story to study the situation in Israel and the West Bank. I mean, I don't have any answers. Like I obviously don't really understand the depth and complexity, but I'm trying, like it's one of those things that I've been trying to understand a little bit more every single year that goes by. And I try to follow it, and I try to make my students realize that it doesn't seem like it's going to go away. Like I feel like it's something that they need to really understand as well as they possibly can. And we spend a couple of weeks studying it, and then I'm like, what do you think? And they're like, just kind of blown away by the complexity of it. And your voice and insight into it whenever you come to visit is really powerful and valuable for the students. So thanks for sharing all that. So let's kind of dive into the faith of Islam. So what to you, obviously you're only speaking for yourself and just your personal experiences, but what to you is the purpose of Islam?
Yeah, so I can answer that question in a lot of different ways. So Muslims believe that our purpose as humans on earth is to worship God. And the purpose of the Quran, or the revelation of the Quran to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is to perfect our character. In other words, to be better people and to treat those around us, not just people, but all of God's creation, with justice.
And I know that you put that action into play in your own personal life. Like I know that you've traveled and worked as a medical interpreter. Can you tell a quick story about that? Like why do you do that?
Yeah. So I spent about 10 days in the refugee camp in Calais, France at the beginning of 2016. And then October through December, I spent about 2.5 months in northern Greece, working as a medical interpreter as well, with primarily Syrian and Iraqi refugees there. I kind of grew up between Columbia, Missouri, as well as Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. So I grew up speaking both Arabic and English. So it's a kind of rare skill that I have, to kind of speak both languages as a first language. And the opportunities kind of just presented themselves, and I was kind of like, well, I have this skill. I also come from a Palestinian background where I have this knowledge of what it is to live in diaspora. And so I felt that, since I had the opportunity and the skills, this is something I kind of felt called upon to do. Yeah.
So building relationships with people who are living as refugees right now around Europe, what would you say is their greatest hope? Like what are the people who are living in refugee camps and situations right now, what are they hoping for?
I mean, just the very basic human rights of like safety, to be able to learn and to live in a decent, safe environment. It's really not a lot when you think about it, but they're a lot of times being denied those kind of basic opportunities, or even just to earn an honest living, Refugees, while they're going through the process of seeking asylum, are not allowed to work. So they're kind of just waiting in limbo a lot of times in these refugee camps that do not offer like a very basic human standard of living. And they're not even allowed to work to kind of pull themselves up or provide for their families. And I worked with a lot of young people whose education was interrupted as well by the conflicts they're coming from, and they honestly just wanted to continue their education and a lot of times be reunited with their families, because a lot of families were split up.
And it seems like the people who are in those situations that just want to go to school, like they're being talked about in the media as something that they're not. I mean, is that your perception as well?
Yeah, definitely. So one thing that I have noticed a lot is the way the media talks about specifically like Syrian refugees, as well as refugees from predominantly Muslim countries, is as like these dangerous people, or these people who we don't know why they're coming here or what their purpose is or what they might do, or, you know, their culture is just vastly different from Western culture, which is interesting because it kind of continues this this trope that has been going on since like the time of the Crusades, as like the West and the East being diametrically opposed to one another, which is really not true. Like, yes, there are differences between those cultures, but there are a multitude of cultures in both the West and the East. And the reality of the situation is that the majority of refugees that are coming out of Syria and Iraq are young men. And that is because they are escaping that violence. They are trying to get away from that violence and trying to get away from being forced to participate in that violence. So they are choosing the only nonviolent option available to them, but they are being painted as violent by default because they are Arab, and a lot of them are also Muslim.
And they're incredibly unlucky as well.
Yes.
You know, so that's like that. This topic is so interesting and challenging and complex to unpack. So what do you think are some of the problems facing Islam as a modern religion from your point of view?
I think Islam as a faith isn't necessarily facing problems. I think the faith is dynamic, and the message of the Quran transcends time and place. But Muslims, like as a group, as a community, are definitely facing a lot of challenges. I think primarily of like how to apply our faith in a rapidly changing global culture and context, especially like with the rise of like technology and like the interconnectedness of our modern world, and like the rise of also like neoliberalism and neocolonialism and a lot of these like white supremacist, neo-Nazi and fascist groups all over the world, and how to kind of enact justice within the bounds of our faith, and as commanded by our faith in this context. So a lot of things.
Yeah, and absolutely. So who are some of your role models in Islam? Like, who do you like look up to? And they can be alive or dead.
Well, there's definitely like a wealth of figures throughout Islamic history of like men and women, like provide a lot of inspiration. And like for me personally as well, like it was definitely impactful to read about Muslim women throughout history who are business women, like warriors and teachers and scholars and students and activists.
I mean, Khadijah, the first wife of the Prophet. I mean, she was an independent and autonomous businesswoman.
Yeah. And she's definitely one of my role models. But I think when it comes down to like everyday sort of inspiration and role models, it really comes down to the people around me. So like my family, my friends, my coworkers, my community here in Colombia, those are the people who kind of teach me every day, like really important lessons about my faith, when it comes to like forgiveness or like persistence, despite everything that's going on, and like just respecting everything around me.
And I know that the community here in Colombia is actually quite diverse. Like, can you just say briefly like what the community is like here in town?
Yeah, so Columbia, Missouri, as we all know, is a small town. So Muslims form about like less than 1% of the overall American population. So in a town of 100,000, there's not a whole lot of Muslims here. So we have one mosque. So everyone goes to the same mosque. And because it's also a university town, we have Muslims from all over the world. So we actually have a fairly large Bosnian population. We have Muslims from Nigeria, from Iraq, from India, from Bangladesh, from here in the U.S., just every possible corner of the world. Like we have Muslims here in Colombia.
And do you celebrate all the different the individual things that people bring with them from their own countries?
Yeah, definitely. During Ramadan especially is when you really see this in action. And it's something really special about our community here in Colombia that you won't necessarily get in other Muslim communities elsewhere in the U.S. So on the weekends, we have community iftars, or that's when we break our fast at the end of the day. So each of those nights is sponsored by a different community within our community. So we might have like a Somali night, or we might have Indian night, or Saudi night. And a lot of different communities will kind of sponsor a night, and you get to sample food from all over the world in 1 month.
Can't beat it.
Yeah.
So what do you think are some of the problems that Islam is trying to solve? Like, what are some of the major problems facing the world today, and how does Islam fit in?
Yeah. So one thing that has kind of stood out to me in the last couple weeks is climate change. And like as Muslims, it's really stressed to care for the earth and for our environment. And that includes not just like plants and the environment, but animals and people and just everything. So throughout the Quran, there's sort of like this repeated phrase of human beings being like the stewards of the earth, right? So we're not here to like rule over the earth. We're here to take care of it. And that's not to say that Muslims have always been the leading example of this, but that is what our faith commands us to do. And really, I think Muslims should be at the forefront of working to, preserve our environment and working to enact justice, because you also have, poor communities and communities of color disproportionately affected by climate change. And so that also goes into racial justice, which is also advocated by Islam. But as far as like the how, so within Islam, there's a tradition of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that essentially says if you see an injustice, then you should change it with your hands. If you cannot, then you change it with your tongue. And if you cannot do that, then you should at least hate it with your heart. And that is the weakest of faith. So we're like commanded to take action. And as far as the how, a lot of times like that does have to start with yourself. And so like I kind of said before, the purpose of the Quran is to perfect our character. So if we're not dealing justly with like our immediate environment, so like with our family, with our friends, if I'm not recycling, then I can't really hope to do anything for climate change on a wider scale, right? So that kind of change has to start internally.
So what are some of your spiritual goals for the future?
For me, it's really about just kind of constantly seeking knowledge, and specifically spiritual knowledge. So the verses that I read at the beginning kind of guide me towards that. So personally, I would one day like to be a chaplain. I think I would probably like to work with young people or in hospitals, specifically with people with chronic illnesses, but more from like a spiritual counseling kind of standpoint. But in order to get there, I've been kind of focusing on trying to increase my knowledge of my faith and like the sciences behind it. So Muslims have been very good about like preserving the Quran, the traditions of the Prophet, and like really making the interpretation of those into actual sciences. So it's very methodical, and that's something I'm kind of working on improving my knowledge of.
So in my introduction, I listed off some books that I've read over the last several years to kind of like push me in my own knowledge as far as Islam goes. Do you have any recommended like books or authors or public figures that you would recommend any listeners to check out to push themselves?
I don't know where to start. I think personally, the kind of books that I read are not like introductory kind of books. I would recommend, like, when you're looking for a book on Islam, to look into who the author is. Are they someone who is actually knowledgeable about Islam? Because a lot of times the people will present themselves as experts on Islam when they really have not studied the faith or have any qualifications to be experts on the faith. So it's important to look for people who actually have that expertise and have that knowledge and that training, and also are familiar with, our culture here in the U.S., right? Because like I said, Islam is dynamic, and it's going to look a little different from culture to culture. So it's important to look for people who are kind of like grounded in American culture, and also have the qualifications to talk about Islam.
I can imagine that would be a little harder to find than you might imagine.
Yes, definitely.
And I do have a bunch of followers that are religious studies professors at universities all over the country, so it's pretty cool. I'm trying to build a neat little community of listeners here. Cool. So just to kind of like finish this up today, first of all, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And I'm just curious, why do you spend time doing things like this? Why did you come on the podcast? Why do you come visit the high schools in town? Why do you do public speaking? Like, what's the purpose?
Well, for me, I wear the headscarf, the hijab, and so I've done this since I was 11. So that kind of put me in a spot that was very visible. I'm a visible Muslim woman, and in our culture, in our political context, that makes people feel empowered, I guess, to approach me and ask questions. So from a very young age, I was talking to strangers about my faith. And so I kind of developed a skill about talking about my faith and explaining to people who know nothing about it in a few sentences what it's about. Because a lot of times these were just sort of chance encounters, like waiting in line for a roller coaster at Six Flags, for example, and trying to explain to this kid why I wear this thing on my head. So it really forced me to take a closer look at my faith and really learn it. And, if I have knowledge about something, then I feel I have a responsibility to share it. So that's kind of why I do what I do.
Do you want to talk about Launch Good for a second?
Sure. So Launch Good is a global Muslim crowdfunding site. We are approaching our 4th birthday. So it's a pretty cool startup to work for. It really provides a counter narrative to what's out there about Muslims and who we are and what we do. And it's really kind of harnessing the generosity of Muslims on a global scale. And I mean, if you just go to launchgood.com, you can see like all of the really amazing things that Muslims are doing and have done, from like films to books and relief efforts and just all sorts of like really amazing things. And it's a really inspiring company to work for sure.
Speaking of generosity, you've been very generous with your time today, and I appreciate having you on the podcast.
Yeah, it was great to be here.
Thanks, Farah. The Classical Ideas podcast is written and performed by me, Greg Soden. Original music is composed and performed by Derek Strybig. His music can be found at www.wearewarmmusic.com. Thanks for listening.